Dr. Ethan Reynolds had been in the operating room for over 3 hours when the call came in. It was an urgent message from the hospital's front desk. A pregnant farmer named Olivia Harper was in premature labor, and her situation was critical. 3 babies were on the way, triplets, to be exact. But it wasn't just a regular high-risk delivery. The babies were in an unusual position, which meant that if things went wrong, Olivia could lose her life, and the babies might not survive either. The problem? Ethan was right in the middle of a crucial surgery, a life-and-death situation for another patient. The moment Ethan heard the word triplets, something in his gut twisted. The medical field always prepared him for the unexpected, but delivering triplets outside of a hospital setting, especially one as rural as the area he served, was a situation he had never faced before. Even the best obstetricians, the ones with all the medical equipment and specialists at their disposal, weren't immune to complications with a delivery like this. The idea of taking on that responsibility himself, without proper resources, made his heart race. But then, there was no time to waste. Olivia Harper wasn't just any patient, she was a member of the local farming community, someone everyone knew and respected. She had been through unimaginable struggles over the years, losing her husband in an accident and raising 2 young children by herself on their farm. Now, she was expecting triplets, and her water had broken prematurely. Her circumstances were rare, but what really got Ethan's attention was the sense of urgency in the nurse's voice. He glanced over at his patient on the operating table, a middle-aged man whose surgery had taken much longer than expected. He was stable, but barely. His heart rate was steady, and all the vital signs indicated that he would be fine for now. Ethan knew he couldn't leave the room without causing potential harm, but the thought of what might happen to Olivia was eating at him. His mind spun, weighing his options, but he only had a few moments to decide. A voice came from the doorway. It was Linda, the hospital's head nurse, a woman who had worked with him for years. She could see the indecision written all over his face. "Dr. Reynolds," she said gently, "Olivia needs you. They can't do this without you. She won't go to the hospital. She's insisting on having the babies on the farm." Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? She won't go to the hospital? This isn't something you can handle at home. It's too dangerous." Linda's voice softened. "She's afraid of the hospital. Her last pregnancy went wrong, and she had complications. She wants to be in the place she feels safest, on her farm. It's a risk, but she's adamant. We can't change her mind." Ethan felt a pang of frustration. He had heard about Olivia's aversion to medical institutions. It was a result of her past experiences with the healthcare system, which had failed her during her last pregnancy. But he wasn't ready to let go of the idea that they could save her and the babies in the hospital where everything was in place for an emergency. "Tell her to come to the hospital," Ethan snapped, running a hand through his hair. "I'll make sure she's comfortable. I'll do whatever it takes, but I can't take on a delivery like this outside of a proper medical environment." Linda didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him for a moment before speaking, her tone more serious than ever. "She refuses. It's not just about comfort. She's afraid the system will fail her again. If you don't go, they may lose her and all the babies." Ethan looked down at the patient on the table again, the decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had no time to debate the logistics. There was no perfect solution. But what he did know was that Olivia Harper needed him, whether he was ready or not. And if something went wrong, he couldn't live with the knowledge that he had hesitated. He let out a long sigh and made his decision. "I'll go. But we need to prepare for everything. You'll have to finish up in here." Linda nodded and hurried off to gather the necessary team members. Ethan quickly scrubbed out of the operating room, throwing on his coat and grabbing his medical bag. His thoughts raced as he walked through the hallways. Olivia was a woman who had seen more hardship in her lifetime than many people could ever imagine. The idea of her enduring this pregnancy alone, without the hospital's resources, was almost too much to bear. As he left the hospital, his eyes scanned the sky, which was beginning to turn gray. It was late afternoon, and the chill in the air made his breath visible. He slid into his car and started the engine. The drive to Olivia's farm would take nearly an hour, but that was time he didn't have. Ethan pushed the car faster than he should have, the engine growling as he tore down the narrow rural roads. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more urgent than the last. Could Olivia even survive this? He had delivered babies before, but not like this, not in a barn, far away from the sterile environment of the operating room. His medical training had prepared him for a lot, but this felt different. There was a gnawing uncertainty in his gut. He had been in the field long enough to know that in rural areas, you took on more responsibility than most doctors in the city. You didn't just treat patients, you became part of their lives. And for people like Olivia, a woman who had been through so much, the pressure was even greater. She didn't have the luxury of taking her chances with modern medicine, and that's what made her stubbornness both heartbreaking and infuriating. As Ethan drove through the winding roads, he remembered the first time he met Olivia. It had been a few years ago when she first came into the hospital after a bad fall off a ladder. She had been carrying a heavy load of hay when she lost her balance and tumbled to the ground, bruising her ribs and breaking her arm. Ethan had treated her and, in the process, learned a bit about her life. She wasn't the kind of person to ask for help. In fact, she hated asking for help. She was proud of the life she had built, even if it was hard, even if it meant doing everything herself. She was a farmer through and through. Her hands, calloused from years of working the land, had earned the respect of everyone in town. But her heart had been shattered too many times. Her husband had died young, leaving her with 2 children and a struggling farm to manage. Despite the hardships, Olivia had carried on. She never asked for sympathy. She simply did what needed to be done. As he neared the farm, Ethan could see the long driveway stretching out before him, flanked by fields of wheat that rippled in the cool breeze. The farmhouse came into view, an old structure that had been in Olivia's family for generations. It looked quiet, serene almost, but Ethan knew better. Inside, there would be nothing serene about what awaited him. He parked the car and stepped out into the cold. The farm had that familiar smell of fresh hay and earth, a comforting scent that reminded him of his own childhood. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. As he made his way toward the barn, he could already hear the murmurs of voices, Olivia's husband, Tom, and a few neighbors who had arrived to help. Tom Harper was a big man, broad-shouldered with rough hands. He was standing near the barn doors, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. When he saw Ethan approach, his face hardened with worry. "Doc, you made it," Tom said, his voice tight. "She's inside. She's ready, but she's scared. We all are." Ethan nodded grimly, but his mind was already racing. The farm might have been a peaceful place in many ways, but today, it felt like a war zone. He wasn't just facing a birth, he was facing something bigger, something that could change the lives of everyone involved. And he had no idea how this story was going to end. The next steps would be critical, and Ethan had no idea whether this would be a triumph of determination or a tragic lesson in the limits of human will. But there was no turning back now. As Ethan stepped through the barn doors, the temperature inside hit him immediately, a cold draft flowing through the wooden beams of the old structure. The faint scent of hay and livestock lingered in the air, mixing with the distinct smell of fresh earth. The dim light of the setting sun filtered through the cracks in the barn's walls, casting long shadows across the makeshift delivery room. The barn had been cleared out for the occasion, with a few blankets laid down on the floor and a stack of hay nearby for extra cushioning. There was no sterile equipment, no operating room lights, just the raw simplicity of a barn, a woman in labor, and a doctor unsure of what lay ahead. Olivia Harper was lying on the ground, her body tensed, her face flushed with the strain of contractions. She was surrounded by family and a few trusted neighbors, people who had come to support her through this difficult time, despite the risks. Tom, her husband, stood by her side, his hand gripping hers tightly. He was clearly trying to remain strong, but his eyes were wide with fear, a mixture of desperation and helplessness. "Doc," Tom called out as Ethan entered. His voice was rough, thick with worry. "She's been in labor for hours. The contractions are getting closer, but she's not dilating as quickly as she should be. She won't leave, Ethan. She won't go to the hospital." Ethan nodded, taking in the scene. The barn was still and quiet, save for Olivia's labored breathing and the occasional murmur of her family trying to offer comfort. Olivia's gaze locked onto his as he approached, and there was something in her eyes, a flicker of both determination and fear. She was a woman who had lived through so much, and this moment, this life-or-death situation, was no different. She wasn't about to let anyone tell her what to do, even if it meant risking her life and the lives of her babies. "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked gently, crouching beside her. His voice was calm, attempting to steady the situation that had already spiraled into chaos. Olivia's lips trembled, but she didn't answer immediately. Her face twisted with pain as another contraction seized her body, and she squeezed her husband's hand with a strength that surprised Ethan. She was strong, too strong, perhaps. But the decision she had made, to refuse the hospital and stay on the farm, was weighing heavily on her. "I'm fine," she finally whispered, her voice strained. "I just want them to be okay. I can't go to the hospital. I won't." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He understood her reluctance. After losing her husband so suddenly in a tragic accident years ago, Olivia had become a woman who relied only on herself. The thought of leaving the familiar walls of her home and the farm where she had built a life after such loss was unbearable. But this wasn't just about comfort. This was about survival, her survival and the survival of the babies growing inside her. The fear in her eyes was palpable. Ethan could tell that the idea of a hospital was terrifying to her. She had suffered from complications in her previous pregnancy, and the doctors had made mistakes that left her scarred both physically and emotionally. She didn't trust the system, and who could blame her? But Ethan knew the risk she was taking by refusing medical assistance. Triplets were already a rare and complicated pregnancy, and without the proper facilities, the chances of complications were skyrocketing. "We can make it through this together, Olivia," Ethan said softly, reaching for her hand. "But you need to trust me. We can save you and the babies if we get the right care." "The hospital." "No," she cut him off, her voice fierce. "I won't go. Not again. Please, Ethan, I need you here. I don't want a doctor who sees me as just another case. I need someone who knows me, someone who knows my heart." Ethan swallowed hard, understanding the weight of her words. The hospital had failed her once before, and the trust had been shattered. She was terrified, and for her, staying on the farm was the only way she could maintain a shred of control in a situation that had already spiraled beyond her grasp. But the truth was, there was no guarantee she would survive this. There was no guarantee that the babies would make it through the delivery. The odds were stacked against them. And yet, Ethan found himself unable to walk away from her plea. Her eyes, full of fear yet resolute in their defiance, tugged at something deep inside him. He turned to Linda, who had followed him into the barn. She was standing by the door, watching him carefully. "Get everything ready," Ethan said, his voice now taking on a more authoritative tone. "We'll need the necessary tools, and we'll have to make do with what we've got. I don't want to take any chances." Linda nodded without hesitation and hurried to collect supplies. Ethan's mind raced, his medical knowledge trying to catch up with the situation at hand. He had never delivered triplets outside of a hospital, let alone under such chaotic conditions. But one thing was clear, he had no choice but to move forward. Ethan knelt down next to Olivia, his hand steadying her as she braced for another contraction. "Olivia," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to monitor your vitals closely. This is going to be intense. I'm going to need you to focus, okay? I need you to breathe and listen to me." She nodded, but it was clear that every muscle in her body was tense, every breath an effort as the next wave of pain hit her. Tom's hand was still holding hers, but there was a visible crack in his calm demeanor. Ethan could see the worry etched on his face as he hovered by Olivia's side, unsure of what to do. "Don't worry, Tom," Ethan reassured him. "We'll do everything we can. But this won't be easy." The tension in the barn was thick, the air heavy with unspoken fear. Olivia's breath quickened as another contraction ripped through her. Ethan's mind was racing, calculating each step, each move, but there was so little room for error. The babies were in a precarious position, and Olivia's body was struggling to keep up with the demands of the labor. As the hours passed, the barn became a battleground of sorts. The dim light of the fading day seemed to add to the sense of urgency. Each contraction came faster, harder, and with it, the knowledge that if things didn't progress as they should, there would be no time to reach a hospital. Ethan had to rely on his instincts now more than ever. He had learned the art of medicine not just through textbooks and training, but through the lessons of real life, lessons that came in moments like these, when lives hung in the balance. Ethan didn't flinch as Olivia cried out in pain. He kept his focus, instructing her to breathe, to push, to stay strong. There were moments when it seemed like nothing was happening, like the world outside the barn had forgotten about them entirely. But Ethan could feel the weight of the decision they had made, the life-and-death gamble that had been set in motion the moment Olivia had insisted on giving birth on her own terms. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first baby was born. It was a miracle, fragile, tiny, but alive. Olivia's breath came in quick bursts of relief, but there was no time to relax. One baby had been delivered, but two more remained. The next hour was a blur of action, tension, and uncertainty. With each new contraction, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared for the next phase of the birth. By the time the final baby emerged, Ethan was drenched in sweat, his hands shaking from the sheer intensity of what he had just witnessed. Olivia was weak, but the triumphant look on her face told him everything he needed to know. Against the odds, she had done it. She had delivered all three of her babies, and they were all alive. It had been a close call, but they had made it through. The barn, which had once felt like a trap, had turned into a place of miraculous survival. The tears in Olivia's eyes were not just from exhaustion. They were tears of gratitude, gratitude for the life she had just fought to protect. Her family gathered around her, amazed at the strength she had shown. Tom kissed her forehead, his face a mixture of awe and relief. As Ethan took a step back, the enormity of the moment settled in. This wasn't just a birth. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive against all odds. And as he watched Olivia, holding her three newborns close to her chest, he knew that something had shifted in him as well. He had given up on the hospital, on the idea of sterile environments and advanced medical technology. In that barn, he had witnessed a raw, unfiltered form of life, an experience that no amount of formal training could ever prepare him for. But as he looked at Olivia and her children, he understood. She hadn't just fought for her babies. She had fought for herself, for her life, for the future she wanted to create. And, in a way, that was what Ethan had been fighting for, too, his own connection to something greater than the clinical confines of a hospital. As night fell, the barn fell into a quiet calm. And in the distance, the sound of cows lowing and the wind rustling through the trees outside seemed like a distant echo of the world that had once existed, before everything changed. Ethan turned to leave, but as he reached the door, Olivia called out to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't turn back, but he knew she didn't need to say more. The bond they had shared in that barn, the life they had fought for together, was something no words could ever fully capture. The weeks that followed the birth were a blur for Ethan. As he moved through his daily routines, his mind kept drifting back to that night in the barn. The entire experience had changed him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Despite the chaos, the fear, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility, he couldn't deny the deep sense of accomplishment and awe that lingered with him. The birth of those 3 babies, against all odds, was something that seemed almost supernatural in its timing. He had been a part of a miracle, a raw and unfiltered moment of life that would forever leave its mark on him. But even miracles came with consequences. Olivia was recovering, and her strength seemed to grow by the day. However, the toll of delivering triplets in such an unconventional way had left its mark on her. The sleepless nights, the pain, the constant worry about the babies, it was all wearing her down, despite her resilient spirit. Tom was doing his best to help, but he had his own share of guilt and frustration to wrestle with. There were moments when he seemed to be on the verge of a breakdown, torn between supporting Olivia and dealing with his own fears of what might have happened if things had gone differently. The pressure was mounting, and Ethan felt it acutely. He had been the one to make the call, the one to stay by Olivia's side when others had begged her to go to the hospital. Now, the consequences of that decision were impossible to ignore. If anything went wrong now, Ethan would have to bear the weight of it alone. Despite his deep knowledge of medicine, there was no denying that there had been no safety net, no backup plan. If anything had gone wrong during those harrowing hours, there would have been no chance for Olivia or her babies. Ethan had never doubted his skills or his instincts before, but this experience had shaken him to his core. It was one thing to save lives in controlled conditions, surrounded by doctors and nurses. It was another to do so with only a few trusted hands, in a barn with no medical equipment to speak of. The weight of that uncertainty gnawed at him each night as he lay in bed, replaying the events over and over again in his mind. The simple, brutal truth was that he didn't have all the answers, and that made him uneasy. One particularly late evening, Ethan found himself walking the quiet streets of town, his mind restless, his thoughts spiraling. He had always found solace in the routine of his work, emergency calls, surgeries, diagnoses, but lately, the uncertainty had become overwhelming. His steps echoed in the empty streets, a stark contrast to the usual bustle of the small town. The lights from the street lamps flickered above, casting long shadows across the sidewalks as he walked past rows of old, familiar houses. He had never questioned his profession before. Medicine was his calling, his purpose. But that night, the weight of his choices and the responsibility he carried seemed unbearable. Was he doing the right thing by staying out here, in this town, with its small problems and even smaller opportunities? Was he supposed to be somewhere else, somewhere bigger, where his skills could truly make a difference? The thought of leaving, of abandoning the people who depended on him, was unthinkable. And yet, the idea kept creeping into his mind. Maybe there was more for him out there. Maybe he needed to take that next step, to push past the confines of this quiet town and into something greater. It was then that his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He checked the screen. It was Olivia. "Ethan," her voice was shaky, her usual calm replaced by something fragile. "I need you. I don't know what's happening, but something's wrong with the babies." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately turned on his heel, heading back toward the town. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. He quickened his pace, barely noticing the cold wind that whipped through his jacket. The walk felt longer than it ever had before. His mind raced as he ran through possible scenarios. He had already seen the babies a few times since their birth, and they had seemed healthy. But now, something was happening that he couldn't explain, and the anxiety was overwhelming. Every moment felt like it mattered more than the last. By the time he arrived at the Harper farm, the sun had set completely, and the barn loomed like a dark silhouette in the distance. Olivia was waiting by the door, her face pale, her eyes filled with worry. "Ethan, I don't know what's wrong," Olivia said, barely able to form the words. "They're not feeding. They're too weak to nurse, and I don't know what to do. They're just crying all the time. And I'm scared. I can't lose them." Ethan's stomach twisted as he followed her inside. The barn had once been a place of life and hope, but now it seemed ominous, filled with the weight of fear. The babies lay on a blanket in the corner, their tiny bodies racked with soft, pitiful cries. Ethan could see the lines of exhaustion in Olivia's face as she approached the babies, but there was no time to comfort her. He needed to act, and quickly. He crouched beside the babies, his hands gentle as he checked each one. They were cold to the touch, their lips slightly blue, and their bodies stiff with the signs of malnourishment. Ethan's heart sank. "The babies are hypothermic," he muttered to himself, scanning the room for anything that could help. "They're not getting enough warmth or nourishment. We need to get them stabilized." Olivia was still standing behind him, trembling. How can we fix this?" Ethan turned to her, his expression serious. "We need to keep them warm and get them fluids. I'll need to take them to the clinic as soon as we can. They need proper care, Olivia." But Olivia shook her head, stepping forward with a defiant expression. I can't let them go to the hospital. I promised them I'd keep them here." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. He could see the desperation in her eyes, but he also knew that if they didn't act fast, they would lose the babies. This wasn't just about comfort or fear, it was about survival. The decision that had been made in the heat of the moment, the choice to stay on the farm, was now threatening the lives of her children. "I know how hard this is," Ethan said gently, "but if we don't get them proper medical attention, there may not be any hope for them. Please, Olivia. You have to trust me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her face breaking with a mixture of fear and relief. "Please," she whispered. "Please save them." Without another word, Ethan carefully wrapped each of the babies in a blanket, trying to warm their tiny bodies as best as he could. The barn seemed colder than ever as he carried them to his truck, with Olivia walking beside him, her face pale and drawn. As they sped toward the clinic, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of worry. The babies were fighting for their lives, and there was only so much he could do on his own. But deep down, Ethan knew he couldn't give up. He had made a promise, not just to Olivia, but to the babies, to their future. When they arrived at the clinic, the staff were ready. Ethan worked quickly, attaching IVs, monitoring vitals, and ensuring the babies were kept warm. Each minute felt like a lifetime. He glanced over at Olivia, who was sitting in a chair, her hands clasped tightly together in a silent prayer. The night seemed to stretch on forever. And as Ethan worked, he thought back to the decision he had made weeks ago, the decision to stand by Olivia's side in that barn. He had made a promise that night, too. No matter what happened, he would do whatever it took to save them all. As dawn broke, Ethan finally stood back, watching as the baby's color slowly returned to normal. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were stable, alive. For now, that was enough. And for Ethan, that night would remain one of the most defining moments of his life. Not because of the medical skills he had brought to the table, but because of the choice he had made, to fight for life when the world had seemed determined to take it away. The weeks after the babies were stabilized were some of the most intense, but also the most rewarding, of Ethan's life. The small clinic had become a second home to him as he spent countless hours monitoring the newborns. Their survival was no longer uncertain, but the road to recovery was long. Despite the progress, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had done up until that point had been in a state of fragile balance, and he couldn't allow himself to let his guard down, not now. Olivia, though grateful for the intervention, was still battling her own demons. Every time Ethan looked at her, he saw the conflicted emotions within her, relief that the babies had survived, but guilt gnawing at her from the inside. She was torn between the decision to stay home and risk everything for the birth, and her doubts about whether she should have gone to the hospital, like everyone else had told her to do. But Ethan never pressed her on it. He had his own doubts to wrestle with, too. At night, when the clinic was quiet, Ethan often found himself reflecting on the events that had led them here. What had pushed him to make that decision? He could have insisted on the hospital, even argued with Olivia to the point of forcing her to go, but he had chosen to trust her, to trust the people who lived here in the quiet corners of the town. There had been a sense of unity in that decision, and as he observed the recovery of the babies, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been the right one. One evening, as he sat at the edge of the crib, watching the babies sleep, Olivia came to join him, her face drawn from exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of weeks of worry. "You saved their lives. I didn't think they were going to make it, but you were right there." Ethan glanced at her, offering a small, tired smile. "You were the one who made the hardest decision, Olivia. I just followed my instincts. But there's no need for thanks. The important thing is that they're here, they're alive." Her gaze dropped to the babies, and for a moment, she was silent, lost in the emotions she had been carrying for so long. "I never thought I'd be a mother. And definitely never to 3 at once," she said, her voice tinged with both disbelief and pride. "But now I look at them, and I can't imagine my life without them." Ethan's heart swelled with compassion. "They're lucky to have you. You're stronger than you think." Olivia's eyes welled up with tears, and she reached out to take Ethan's hand. "You've been with us through all of this. I'll never forget it. I don't think I could have done it without you." The vulnerability in her voice struck Ethan, and for the first time in a long while, he realized just how much he had invested in this. It wasn't just the medical part, it was everything. He had invested in Olivia's story, in her dreams, and in the fragile lives of these babies. There was something deeply human about what had unfolded. This wasn't just a medical case, it was a testament to perseverance, to the relentless pursuit of life, even when everything seemed stacked against it. The days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued to care for the babies, overseeing their recovery, ensuring they were fed, and checking their development. The road ahead was uncertain, but the triplets had made it past the most dangerous phase. Their tiny hands grasped his fingers, their cries no longer weak and helpless, but strong and determined. They were fighters. But the challenges didn't end there. Ethan soon realized that, while the babies were doing better, Olivia's emotional health had taken a toll. The weight of what had happened, of the risks she had taken, of the long, sleepless nights, had left her physically and mentally drained. She was no longer the same woman who had boldly given birth in the barn. She had become someone more fragile, someone who needed support she hadn't asked for. One evening, after Ethan had completed his rounds, he noticed Olivia staring out the window of her kitchen, her face pale and distant. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the fields stretched out into the twilight. He walked over and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Olivia," he said softly. She turned to face him, and for a brief moment, her eyes were empty, as though she were lost in some faraway place. "I don't know what's happening to me," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I feel so exhausted, Ethan. I feel like I'm drowning in it all." Ethan's heart sank, but he didn't hesitate. He sat down next to her, his presence a silent comfort. "You've been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to bear. But you're not alone in this. You have people who care about you, people who want to help." Her eyes welled with tears, and she shook her head. "I don't want to burden anyone. I don't even know who I am anymore." Ethan gently took her hand, squeezing it with reassurance. "You're Olivia Harper. And you're doing the best you can. It's okay to need help. It's okay to take a step back and focus on you, too. She nodded slowly, her tears falling silently, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to lean into Ethan's comforting presence. She was strong in her own right, but even the strongest of people needed a moment to rest, to break down, and to heal. And Ethan was there to support her every step of the way. As the weeks went on, life at the clinic began to stabilize. The babies continued to grow, and Olivia started seeking more help for herself, from both Ethan and other members of the community. Slowly, she found her footing again, regaining the strength that had made her a force of nature. But the scars, the internal battles, remained. She had made a life-changing decision, one that would impact her for years to come, but it was the right one. The town, too, began to see the effects of that night in the barn. Ethan's decision to stay and help Olivia had resonated in ways he hadn't anticipated. The quiet farm, once a symbol of struggle and isolation, had become a symbol of community and support. People came by to check on Olivia, to offer assistance, and the once close-knit town was stronger for it. Ethan knew, in the core of his being, that his choice to be there for Olivia and the babies had rippled through their lives in a way no one could have predicted. The emotional growth of the town, of its people, had come from something deeply human, the act of caring, of reaching out when things seemed impossible. And for Ethan, it was a turning point in his own life. He had made a choice to stay, to help, and in doing so, he had not only transformed the lives of Olivia and her family but also reshaped his own understanding of what it meant to be a healer. It wasn't just about fixing broken bodies, it was about healing the mind, the soul, and the spirit. And as the seasons passed, as the triplets grew stronger and Olivia regained her sense of self, Ethan realized that this was the greatest gift he could offer, being there when it mattered most. But no one could predict the future. And as Ethan walked through the clinic one last time before the triplets turned a year old, he couldn't shake the feeling that another unexpected twist was coming, one that would once again test everything he had learned. Life, after all, had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected. But for now, at least, he knew one thing for certain: they had made it through the storm. The days that followed were filled with both a sense of calm and a quiet undercurrent of uncertainty. Ethan had stayed in the small town for months now, watching Olivia and the babies recover. The once intense drama of that fateful night in the barn had settled into a distant memory, but it lingered in the back of his mind, shaping his every move. He couldn't deny the profound impact it had left on him, on everyone involved. There was a newfound sense of purpose in his life, but also a strange weight that came with it. Healing others was no longer just about medical procedures, it had become about understanding people on a deeper level, offering emotional support in moments of crisis, and being present when the world seemed to be falling apart. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved, that something was yet to come. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that this journey wasn't over. The twists of fate that had pulled him into this rural town and placed him in the center of Olivia's struggle were just the beginning. The world had a way of testing people in ways they didn't expect, and Ethan was about to face the most unexpected twist yet. It started one afternoon when he received a phone call from the hospital in the city. It wasn't unusual for him to receive calls from colleagues in the field, but this one felt different. The voice on the other end was familiar yet strained. "Dr. Ethan, it's Dr. Warren. We've got a situation on our hands. We need you to come in. It's a high-risk case." Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline in his veins. He hadn't been expecting to return to his former life in the city, not after all the time he had spent here, immersed in the slower pace of rural life. He had come to love the town, the people, and the simplicity of life. But the pull of his medical expertise, of the work he had trained for, was undeniable. He agreed to come in, though something inside him hesitated. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he couldn't ignore the call to action. He packed his bags and said his goodbyes to Olivia and the babies, promising he would return soon. The babies had grown so much in the past months, and Olivia was beginning to feel like herself again. She had come to rely on Ethan, and although their bond had been built on the foundation of a medical crisis, there was something more, something unspoken between them. They had both been through something that had changed them, but for now, it was best to part ways, to see where their separate paths would lead. Ethan's drive to the city was long, and the closer he got to the hospital, the more the weight of the situation began to settle in. He had always thrived in high-pressure situations, but this one felt different. The unknowns gnawed at him. What could possibly be so urgent that they had called him back into action? When he arrived at the hospital, he was immediately briefed on the case. A young woman, no older than Olivia, had been brought in after a traumatic accident. She was pregnant with twins, both in critical condition. Her injuries were severe, but there was still a slim chance to save the babies. The medical team had already performed the first round of interventions, but they needed Ethan's expertise to stabilize the woman long enough for an emergency C-section. The situation was delicate. The woman was in shock, and her body was on the verge of shutting down. Time was running out. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what needed to be done. He entered the operating room, his mind laser-focused on the task at hand. The hours that followed were a blur of rapid decisions, precise incisions, and intense teamwork. The babies were born, small and fragile, but alive. As the surgical team worked to stabilize the woman, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The stakes had never been higher. Lives were hanging in the balance, and he was the one entrusted with their fate. After the operation, as Ethan stood outside the ICU, staring at the blinking monitors, he realized that this case was a reflection of everything he had learned since coming to the town. It wasn't just about medical procedures or cold, calculated decisions, it was about the lives behind those decisions. It was about the people who were counting on him, who trusted him to make the right choices in moments of chaos. He had faced his own doubts and fears in the past, but this situation was different. This was his chance to prove that he was more than just a surgeon, he was a healer, a person who could make a difference in the lives of others when it mattered most. As the days passed, the woman's condition began to stabilize. Ethan continued to monitor the twins, ensuring they were receiving the care they needed. It wasn't an easy road. There were setbacks, moments when the baby's health seemed to teeter on the edge, but with every passing day, they grew stronger. The young mother, who had been unconscious for much of the time, slowly regained consciousness and began to recover as well. Ethan visited her regularly, checking on her progress and offering words of encouragement. She had been through so much, and he could see the fear in her eyes as she realized the gravity of what had happened. But there was also a glimmer of hope, of determination. She wanted to be there for her children, and Ethan was determined to help her get there. One day, as he sat by her bedside, she reached out and took his hand. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand. "You're strong. You've been through so much already. But we're not done yet. Your babies need you, and we'll get through this together." The bond between them was different from the one he had with Olivia, but it was just as real. It was a bond forged in the fires of crisis, built on trust and shared vulnerability. As Ethan looked down at the woman and her newborns, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. This was why he had become a doctor, why he had dedicated his life to helping others. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition, it was about the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, and the moments when he had been able to make a real difference. But just as things seemed to be settling into a routine, the unthinkable happened. A complication arose that no one had anticipated. The woman's health began to decline rapidly, and the twins' condition deteriorated as well. The medical team scrambled to find a solution, but there was little they could do. Ethan knew that this was the moment when everything would be tested, the culmination of everything he had learned, everything he had experienced in the past few months. The battle wasn't over. Ethan fought with everything he had, pushing himself to the limits of his physical and mental endurance. He made difficult decisions, took risks, and relied on his training to guide him through the storm. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The woman's heart gave out, and despite their best efforts, the twins didn't survive. Ethan stood in the quiet aftermath, his body aching from the hours of work. The weight of the loss hung heavily on him. He had done everything he could, but it still hadn't been enough. It was a harsh reminder of the fragility of life, of the thin line between success and failure. He had saved so many lives in his career, but this one felt different. It felt personal. The family, the life, the potential, it had all been taken too soon. He left the hospital that night, his heart heavy with grief, but also with a sense of resolution. In this line of work, there were no guarantees. Sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, things didn't go the way you hoped. But that didn't mean the work was any less meaningful. He had made a difference in the lives of so many people, and he would continue to do so, even in the face of loss. As Ethan drove back to the small town, his thoughts turned to Olivia and the babies. He had made a choice to leave them for a time, to fulfill his duty as a doctor, but the work he had done in the city had only reinforced what he had learned there. Healing wasn't just about the physical, it was about the emotional, the human connection, the resilience to keep going no matter what. When he arrived back at the clinic, he was exhausted but at peace. The loss weighed on him, but he knew it was part of the journey. He would never forget the woman and the twins he had tried to save, but he had also learned something invaluable. He had learned the importance of caring for people, of never giving up, and of holding on to hope, even when the world seemed to offer none. The sun had set as Ethan arrived back at the clinic, the sky bathed in hues of purple and orange, signaling the end of yet another long day. But this one felt different. The weight of the previous days, the victories, and the losses, hung heavy on his heart. As much as he wanted to rest, he knew there was still work to be done, work that had nothing to do with the medical field but had everything to do with the people he had come to care about. Olivia had called him earlier, asking if he would come over to see the babies, now 6 months old and thriving. Her voice, though strained from the months of late nights and adjustments, held a warmth that reminded him of why he had stayed in this small town. It was the people, the community, that made the difference. It was the connections, the quiet moments of humanity shared between strangers that had transformed him in ways he had never expected. As he walked into Olivia's home, he was greeted by the soft cooing of the babies, their eyes bright and alert, their little hands reaching out as though they recognized him. Olivia was sitting in a rocking chair, holding them both, her tired eyes filled with an unspoken gratitude. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he approached. This was why he had come back. Not just for the medical challenges, but for the lives he had touched. For the families like Olivia's, who had entrusted him with their most precious moments. "How are they doing?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Olivia looked up, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she looked down at the twins. "They're growing so fast. I still can't believe it sometimes. It feels like just yesterday that they were born. They're healthy, and I'm doing much better, thanks to you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan had been part of their journey since the very beginning, and though the road had been filled with challenges, it had been worth it. "They're lucky to have you," Ethan replied, his words coming from the heart. The connection they shared had deepened over time. What had started as a doctor-patient relationship had transformed into something more, a deep, abiding respect and understanding of one another. Olivia smiled, a bittersweet look crossing her face. "I know you said you'd be here for me, but I never expected it to mean so much. You've been a friend, a guide. I don't know how I would have made it through all of this without you." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. His time in the city, where he had been surrounded by patients but often isolated from the deeper connections, felt so far behind him now. In this town, with Olivia and the people he had met, he had found something he had never expected. Purpose. True purpose. It wasn't about the surgery or the diagnosis, it was about the people. He reached out, gently touching one of the baby's tiny hands. "I'm just glad I could help. But you're the one who did the hard work. You're the one who's been there for them every step of the way." Olivia's smile softened, and she leaned back in the chair, clearly exhausted but content. Ethan pulled up a chair beside her, watching the babies as they slowly drifted to sleep in her arms. The sound of their soft breaths filled the room, a symbol of the peace that had come after so much turmoil. It was in these quiet moments, Ethan realized, that life was truly defined. It wasn't in the chaos of the operating room or the decisions that had to be made in the heat of the moment. It was in the moments of stillness, of connection, where real healing took place. He had seen so many patients, so many families, but this one had stayed with him. The love that Olivia had for her children, the way she had persevered through so much, he had witnessed it all firsthand. And in a way, it had transformed him. But as the days passed and the twins continued to grow, Ethan's thoughts were never far from the experience in the city, the lives he had tried so hard to save. The loss of the woman and her babies weighed on him, reminding him of the fragility of life. The reality of his work as a doctor was that not every story had a happy ending, not every patient could be saved. There were moments when he had to let go, moments when the world didn't work in the way he had hoped. But in the face of that, he had learned to push forward, to keep fighting for the ones who still had a chance. As the weeks stretched into months, Ethan's connection with the town deepened. He found himself becoming an integral part of the community, not just as a doctor but as someone people could rely on, someone who offered not just medical expertise but also a sense of comfort and stability. The same people who had welcomed him with open arms now saw him as one of their own. He had come here to heal, to help, but he had also found healing in the process. The people in this small town had taught him what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. The news of Olivia's recovery and the growth of her babies spread through the town like wildfire. People who had once been strangers now greeted Ethan with smiles and words of thanks, even if they had never directly interacted with him. His reputation had grown, not because of his skill in the operating room but because of his genuine care for others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the fields, Ethan stood on the porch of the clinic, looking out at the world around him. It was a peaceful scene, one that was so different from the busy, chaotic city life he had once known. Here, time moved at its own pace, and everything felt a little more connected. He thought about his life before all of this, his work in the city, the pressures, the constant rush to save lives, but in this moment, he realized something profound: none of that had truly mattered in the way he had once thought it did. What mattered now were the relationships, the lives he had touched, and the people who had allowed him to be part of their journey. In that moment of clarity, he understood that the real purpose of his work had nothing to do with medical accolades or the rush of surgery. It was about being present, about showing up for the people who needed him. It was about helping them heal in ways that went beyond the physical. It was about teaching them to believe in their strength, to hold on to hope even in the darkest moments. As Ethan stood there, lost in his thoughts, Olivia appeared on the porch with the twins in her arms, their small hands reaching out to him, their eyes full of trust. She smiled, her tired face softening as she met his gaze. "They're growing so fast, Ethan. I'm so grateful for everything you've done for us. For being here when we needed you most." Ethan smiled back, his heart full. "It's been an honor, Olivia. Truly. I don't think I've ever been more grateful for anything in my life." And just like that, Ethan realized that his time in this small town had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully explain. He had come here as a doctor, but he was leaving as something more, a part of a community that had shown him the power of human connection, of healing not just bodies, but souls. And as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, the promise of tomorrow was filled with endless possibilities. He knew that no matter where life would take him next, he had found a place, a purpose, and a family that would forever hold a piece of his heart. The lessons learned in this small town had transformed him in ways that no surgery ever could. He had learned that the true healing came not just from his medical skills, but from the connections he had formed, from the way he had been able to be present in the lives of those who needed him. In the end, it wasn't the procedures or the titles that defined him, it was the people he had touched, the lives he had changed, and the love that had been shared in those quiet moments of care and understanding.